What a difference a few days can make. This Sunday is Resurrection Sunday, and that means tomorrow is Good Friday. Last Sunday was Palm Sunday, which comes from Matthew chapter 21, verses 1 through 9. There, Jesus entered Jerusalem, and he's met with praises. He is all but crowned as the King of Israel. The people throw their cloaks on the ground as a sign of submission and a recognition of his authority. They put palm branches on the ground before him as a sign of victory. The conquering king is here. Yet what a difference a few days makes. The tone changes, the cries change from celebration and acceptance to rage and shame. From joy to disappointment, from chants of behold our king to scoffing and mocking, hail the pretend king of the Jews. Let's look at John's Gospel, chapter 18, verses 28 through 19, verse 17. Here we will see Jesus on trial before Pilate. In this trial, we see that Jesus is declared innocent. Jesus is the true king of the people of Israel. Yet Jesus is sentenced to death on a cross despite being the innocent king of the universe. The reason from the worldly perspective is political. Pilate and the Jewish religious and political leaders want to maintain political power. Yet this was according to God's providential plan. Look at verses 28 and 29 of chapter 18. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could observe the Passover. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" Now, just prior to this in John's Gospel, Jesus was arrested and on trial before Annas and Caiaphas. These two felt threatened by Jesus, so they sent Jesus to Pilate, who was the governor of that region for Rome. During this time period, the land of Israel, and so Jerusalem, was under the reign of Rome. Caesar ruled from Rome, but he would place governors in other lands that he had conquered outside of the Rome city limits. So Pilate then governed Israel, representing Caesar and Rome. The Roman government had a special deal with Israel. They would allow them to worship their God. They could keep their own laws. They could sacrifice in the temple. They could rest on the Sabbath and do just about whatever else they wanted, so long as nothing got out of hand. There could be no uprisings against Rome by the Jewish people. The Roman government even allowed Israel to maintain their own leadership structure, which were these Jewish religious and political leaders. This is important to know because for Pilate and for the leaders of Israel, Jesus had become a political threat to them. So the Jews took Jesus to Pilate because Pilate was also responsible for keeping peace among the people of Israel. So when they arrived, the Hebrew leaders didn't go inside to Pilate's headquarters since they were concerned about Jewish ritual purity. Now this is ironic, which is a repeated theme all throughout John's Gospel. The irony is that they have defiled themselves by falsely condemning their own Creator of saying exactly who he is, namely, God in human flesh. Notice here, Pilate understands them well enough that he graciously comes out to them, that way that they won't be considered unclean just before the Passover. We see the initial conversation in verses 29 through 31. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." Then the Jews said to Pilate, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was spoken to show by what kind of death he would die. Now the Jewish and political religious leaders, they have bad motives here. They do not want to be held responsible for condemning and crucifying Jesus. They want to avoid any potential problems back in Israel. So if Pilate condemned Jesus and he sentenced Jesus to death, they could say, "Hey, look, it was Pilate that condemned him, not us. It was Pilate that crucified him, not us." But Pilate just wants to know, what has Jesus done wrong? Yet they don't give him any details. They just say that Jesus was guilty of vaguely doing evil. Again, this is ironic as the story continues because Jesus had obviously committed no crimes and no evil doing. So Pilate gets annoyed and he dismisses them, saying, "You go and you judge him yourselves by your own law." But they again appeal to Pilate, saying that we can't do this because it's actually against the law. So then Pilate goes to Jesus to see what's going on from his perspective in verses 33 through 36. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or do others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered him, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered him, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not of this world." Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" At first, Pilate seems annoyed. He just wants to know, what have you done wrong? And simple logic would say that Jesus has certainly committed a crime, otherwise the Jewish religious leaders wouldn't bother to bring Jesus to Pilate. So Jesus is with Pilate here, and he is clearly telling him about his kingship. He says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were of this world, then my servants would be fighting, so I wouldn't be delivered over to the Jews and to you." And notice three things here. First, Jesus admits he is a king with a kingdom, because he is. King Jesus is God Almighty, the sovereign Lord over all things. However, second, his kingdom does not belong to this world. And third, Jesus willingly gives himself over to the Pharisees and so to Pilate. No one forces Jesus. Jesus does not put up a fight. Jesus did not try to hide or even flee. In fact, Jesus rebukes Peter for trying to fight and defend him with his sword. Now notice, Pilate heard Jesus loud and clear, as we see in verses 37 through 39. Pilate said, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king, and for this purpose I was born. And for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Jesus then here, he comes into the world to proclaim the truth, that he is the king. That's why he came, one of the many reasons that Jesus became man, as we see in John's Gospel. This is the truth that Jesus tells us. He is king. And everyone who belongs to King Jesus hears his voice and listens to his voice, since Jesus is our good shepherd. Now, Pilate's next response is really interesting. Jesus says he comes to tell us about the truth, and listen to how Pilate responds. What is truth? You see, denying God, denying objective moral truth, and denying moral absolutes is not something new or even modern, like many atheists would like us to believe. There's nothing new under the sun. Pilate is not even the first postmodernist here who rejects the notion of a knowable truth. His statement here indicates that he doesn't believe there is a clearly defined and knowable truth. Pilate's thought is this: who can even know or say what is true, because no one knows? Pilate says this, and as he turns away, he then went back outside to the Jews and told them, "Look, I find no guilt in him." And here is Pilate's first verdict: not guilty, innocent. Again, here is the irony. Even this secular, non-Jewish rejecter of truth recognizes the reality. Jesus is innocent. Jesus has done nothing wrong. Jesus is falsely accused. So Pilate wants to give the Israelite leaders a chance to change their minds, as we see in verses 39 through 40. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" They cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. "Do you want me to give you your innocent king? Do you want him to be released?" says Pilate. And they say, "No, not Jesus. Give us the rightly accused criminal." Again, notice the irony here. John's gospel is full of irony. The Israelites would rather release a known criminal than the rightful king over all things. So as we see in chapter 19, verses 1 through 3, "Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews,' and struck him with their hands." Pilate beats Jesus. The soldiers mock him by putting this crown of thorns on his head. They array him in a purple robe, and purple is the color of royalty. They pretend to bow down before him. They mockingly approach him and say, "Hail, the King of the Jews." They physically abuse him. They laugh and they scoff. This is how the world treats our Creator, the King of all things. He was despised and rejected by the people he created. Despite this treatment, Pilate tries to make his verdict clearly heard, as we see in verses 4 and 5. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you that you may know. I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold, the man." Now for the second time, Pilate plainly declares he is innocent. And he does it for a purpose here, so that the people may know the truth. Pilate wants them to know that Jesus is innocent. And then Pilate says, "Behold, here is the man." And this phrase is like saying, "Look at this poor guy." It's a statement of pity, because again, Pilate knew that Jesus is innocent. And he wanted everyone else to see it. But here is their response in verse 6. "When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, 'Crucify him! Crucify him!' And Pilate said to them, 'Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him.' Crucify him." This was their plea. "Kill him, the King of heaven." And notice, Pilate says, "You take him, you crucify him, since I don't have a reason to." Pilate wants nothing to do with this, and for the third time, he declares Jesus not guilty. Now, numbers are really important in the Bible. 3 in Scripture is the number of perfection and completeness. So John wants us and everyone else to know yet another instance of irony. Jesus is put on trial, and he was declared innocent 3 times. Jesus is completely acquitted. He is innocent. Pilate had no idea what he'd just done. And remember, Pilate's not Jewish here. Jesus is completely innocent. He's completely perfect. So the Jews finally give him a reason in verse 7. They say, "We have a law, and according to the law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." This is a reference to Leviticus 24:16, which says, "Whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him." Their accusation here is that Jesus has made himself equal to God. Their accusation is that Jesus claimed to be the divine Son of God. Oftentimes, non-Christians will say, Jesus never claimed to be God. Now, this is perhaps one of the most ignorant statements a person can make about Jesus, because the New Testament is clear on the reason why Jesus was killed by the Jewish religious leaders. The New Testament is clear why they hated Jesus so much. Now, this is the reason why Jesus was killed from a human perspective. He claimed to be divine. He claimed to be God. Blasphemy was the specific charge. Again, the irony though, Jesus is in fact God. He is the God-man, 100% God and 100% man. The only way that God could fulfill all of his promises in the Old Testament was to do it himself as a human. Therefore, he is innocent because he is God. He is holy and righteous. Next, look at verses 8 through 11. When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "Will you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who has delivered me over to you has the greater sin." Pilate becomes more afraid, which shows that he was already fearful to begin with. This just made it worse. So he immediately goes back to Jesus and asks, "Where are you from?" And John's gospel makes this simple and clear. Jesus is from heaven. He is the creator and the sustainer of the universe. He dwells outside of time, yet he stepped into time, space, and history. The incarnation is amazing. Now, notice Jesus does something peculiar after Pilate asks this question. He remains silent. He doesn't say a word. And this points us to Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7. And of course, Isaiah 53 is worth reading, especially during the Easter time. Isaiah 53:7 says this, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is led to the shearers, so he opened not his mouth." This Old Testament passage vividly predicts the atoning sacrifice of the suffering servant. This is the only passage in the Old Testament that says a righteous man will die as a sacrifice. A man will be the atonement for sin. On behalf of God's people, a man will die. It was written roughly 700 years before the Gospels. So at this point, Pilate becomes indignant. He reminds Jesus that he has the authority to pardon him or kill him. But Jesus boldly tells him the truth. "You wouldn't have any authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from God." Pilate, in his pride and arrogance, thinks the situation is completely in his hands. Pilate thinks he's in control. But in reality, Pilate only has authority because God has given it to him. Pilate did as God determined he should. Next, look at verse 12. From then on, Pilate sought to release Jesus, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." Pilate tried to release Jesus, but the Jews aren't interested. And did you notice how the Jews convinced Pilate to condemn Jesus? They make a political play. They accuse him of not being loyal to Caesar. They put him against Jesus by saying, Jesus opposes Caesar by making himself a king. You oppose Caesar if you don't condemn and crucify him. Now, as a politician, this put Pilate in a difficult spot. If he lets Jesus go, he opposes Caesar because Jesus said he is a king. If this gets back to Caesar, then Pilate would have been alleviated of his duties on the account of his death. His own life, his position of power, was more important. Next, look at verses 13 through 16. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat him down upon the judgment seat, at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." And they cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate says, "Look, behold, here is your king." And this is an ironic and even prophetic proclamation. Pilate tells them, "This is your king." Yet they respond, "Get him away from us, crucify him. We want nothing to do with him." This is how the world welcomes our king. Dumbfounded, Pilate he asks again, "Do you really want me to kill your king?" And the response is even more painfully truthful and honest. The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Here the Jewish political and religious leaders show their true loyalty. They proudly proclaim that they have no king but Caesar. And as Jesus has made abundantly clear, as you see all throughout John's gospel, they do not belong to God, they do not know God, and this is evidence. Their primary concern is found in earthly power, wealth, and prestige. They are concerned not about God and the truth of His Word, but about themselves. In fact, they completely reject their true King, the one and only true God, when they say, "We have no other king but Caesar." So Pilate does as they wish in verse 16. So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. Jesus is falsely accused, yet endures his death, as we will see. This shows us that something bigger is happening, that his death has purpose. As Mark 10:45 tells us, Jesus came to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus died in our place. Jesus died to take away our sin, and Jesus died to redeem his people. His execution began by being declared the good King. Jesus, he is the long-awaited, long-promised Messiah. He is God in human flesh, the innocent King condemned to death.